Hi everyone, I'm Cassandra from the Oxford Weaving Studio. Thank you so much for joining me for today's online video tutorial on how to set up your frame loom with your warp. We're going to show you using one of our frame looms here and how you set up your warp, which runs in this direction. Now, if you haven't woven before, you may not know that getting the correct tension for your warp is really important. It will give you a beautiful, a much more accurate and consistent outcome for your woven projects. So follow along on this online tutorial and you'll have your warp set up in no time. Now, if you like the tutorial, you can like the video, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, or simply follow us at Oxford Weaving Studio on both Instagram and through Facebook. So here we have our frame loom. Now, each frame loom is designed a little bit differently. Our frame loom is designed with hand weaving in mind. So if you learn how to weave on our frame looms, it has very specific spacing, much narrower spacing than most frame looms that you'll find out there, or even tapestry looms. Now they're set up with 4, 8 or 16 ends per inch, and that actually matches set spacing again for hand weavers. So you can see here that our frames are designed with these little notches, so that your yarns will sit on the top of these notches. And we're going to start off with our warp string. Now again, we use mercerized cotton warp string. So if you can see, it's got a little bit of a shine, and it is also really quite strong. And it comes in these nice little bundles, tapestry bundles, where they're wound in a figure of 8 so that they don't get tangled. Now they do sometimes, but if you pull, you hold the center section here, you can see this is wound around the center. If you hold that from the center and you pull out gently, you should be able to unravel your warp thread quite nicely without having any tangles. Now what you want to do is you want to measure the length of your warp, the length of your frame loom, so that will determine the length of your warp. Now, bearing in mind, I'm not going to set up the full width. You could if you'd like, but it's the same process whether you set up a full warp or a test warp, which is what I'll do for you today. Now, I'm going to set it up with 10 warp ends, and you can see here that I'm going to measure out 1, 'So I do 10 plus 11, just in case we need extra. And you take your scissors and you cut off the length. Now you could unwind this at the same time as you're actually doing your warp, but sometimes it makes it a little bit easier and it prevents it from tangling, but today we're going to do it this way. So now I grab the warp end and we're going to wrap it around the base of your frame loom. Now you see I've started a little bit, maybe about 8 or 10 rows in. Now that's because I'm trying to center my warp across. Now you could match exactly and count how many from each end so that your piece is centered, but you could set it up so that it weaves only on the left or the right. It's really just a preference thing. So now we're going to do a double knot. So a single knot around the frame inside the notch that you are that you want to start with, and then a double knot. And if that has worked, there we go. Now you notice here that the knot is sitting on the inside of the frame. I haven't knotted it so that the frame is at the bottom. The reason being is because when you pull and set up your warp thread, it's going to want to slide around to this point anyway, so you always try and have the knot here on the center. Now, now what we want to do is we want to, under tension, we want to pull our warp thread gently and match it up with the same notch at the top. Now can you see here that the option is to go over the top? Now again, showing you those notches, that's how it's going to sit on the top of your frame loom. And you're simply going to keep your frame loom in position, hold it so that it goes under the notch at the bottom and back up on the top, over the top, down under the bottom. Now you might need your thumb, as I've shown here, just to keep it in the notch as you're going along, but usually just a finger should do the trick. Holding it again. Now the trick to having a nice even warp is keeping regular tension. Now the type of warp that you use to set up your your loom will play a major part in that, which is why for beginners I always suggest you use a nice mercerized cotton. Again, it's a little bit more slippery, so that your warp ends up being quite firm and tight, and your weft threads slide along nicely along it. But you could use a lot of different things, and we'll show that in videos to come. So now we have our 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 warp ends, and I said I was going to set up 10, so let's do 10 down here, and I've got quite a lot of extra, so that's 10 for you. What you do when you are done with setting up your warp ends, and now can you see also I've done it in pairs, is a question I get asked quite frequently. As a beginner and as a general rule, you always want to set up an even number of warp threads. The reason being is that you knot your project at the bottom on both ends. If you were to stop your weaving and tie a knot at the top end, when you come to finish your project, you're going to find that you have an odd number, and that will create problems in most instances. If you're using a hanging rod, or if you're trying to finish your work in a really neat fashion, having an odd number always is a little bit tricky. So I do recommend always that you have an even number. Now, of course, there are always exceptions to that rule. For example, if you're weaving a triangle and you wanted to get a nice point in the middle, you might want to have an uneven number of warp threads, which would allow you to have a nice point, let's say a triangle or a Christmas tree, etc. But that, again, we'll show in a future video. So once you have your warp thread down at the bottom, you're going to, before you tie it off, and not straight away, we're going to just wrap it around these notches so it doesn't move, and we're going to check our tension. So once you've done that once or twice and it's kind of being held without you doing anything, I like to check my warp tension. Now you could hold it while you're doing this, or you could leave it, but essentially you want to check if your warp thread is even. Now you don't want to have any individual loose ones, or you don't want to have any that are odd. So if you can check, you get a nice bounce, and I can see maybe one here feels a bit looser and one over here. So the way to straighten that before you've tied your knot, if you've already tied your knot, you either have to unpick or undo the knot, or you may have to start again. Because it's really important to get your warp right. So what you do is, if you've already knotted this one's not going anywhere, you don't have to change that one. You simply pull up on the first, pull down on the second. Can you see here I've loosened and I've created a bit of slack? That's a tiny little bit of slack that I've created. Then you're going to pull up on the third, and again I'm getting all the slack out, and down on the fourth, up on the fifth, down on the sixth, up on the seventh. So again, I think you get the picture here, and up again, and then down. So now you can see how much slack I had, and can you see that's a lot better tension. So you're going to undo that. Now the tricky part is making sure you maintain that tension while you actually knot your project. So what I like to do is I like to tighten it up across there. Sometimes I knot directly, but to get a much better tension and even tension, what I do is I have gotten to the habit of winding it around and using the notches on my frame loom to keep that tight. So once you've got that tight, you're still holding it tight there. You've got your knot tight, and you're going to gently pull it down until you reach the bottom, and then again, second knot. Now you can do this in so many different ways, and this is not by all means not the only way to tie a knot. I'm not the best at tying knots, but I've worked out with time what works for me. So that should give me a nice even tension. Now again, if you found that after you've tied that last one it's a little bit, you can go back and try and fix the others, but essentially you want to have a nice spring to it, so that when you come to remove it, your project at the end, you can slip it off the notches, or simply cut at the bottom as you need and remove your work from there. But that is how you get a nice even tension on your warp and set up your frame loom for the first time. Happy weaving!